morning and welcome. I invite you to turn to number 1008 in the teal hymnal, and let's join in singing When Our Heart is in a Holy Place. Number 1008.
Good morning and welcome to the First Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Ann Arbor, Michigan. We are a liberal, progressive, spiritual community that has been meeting continuously here in the city of Ann Arbor since 1865, bringing alive a vision of what it can mean to be on a personal search for truth and meaning in your own life while supporting to community as community supports you, working towards and nurturing a beloved world for all, touched and graced by freedom and justice. I'm the Reverend Manish, Mishra-Marzetti. I serve our community as senior minister, and it's my joy and delight to be accompanied in today's service by Stella Anderson, our Director for Spiritual Growth and Development, Carter Smith, our Acting Director of Music Ministries, Mike Halerz, our technological consultant, Allison Halerz, our Pianist-in-Residence, and the Chalice singers. Wherever you may be joining us from, whether it is at home or here in Michigan and Ann Arbor or elsewhere in our nation or our broader world, we are delighted that you've made the choice to be together in community with one another and with us on this day. This is a particularly special Sunday for us. We are having an abbreviated worship service this morning as we prepare for some community time together in a special congregational meeting in which we'll discuss two discrete topics: the topic of our community's investment in solar panels for our building and grounds, as well as the topic of our denomination's consideration of a revision to key provisions of our collective bylaws. Those conversations will be happening as soon as the conclusion of this worship service, so we invite you to stay tuned and stay together in community following the close of this worship service as we then move into that time of collective discussion, conversation, and reflection together. For now, as we continue to deepen this time together and prepare for deeper and greater community conversations, we invite you to join together in a moment in this time of reflection and deepening.
Good morning. As we are joining together virtually this morning to prepare to do the important work of this congregation, we begin our time together by lighting a chalice. Our chalice reminds us of our connections to one another, our connections to the broader community of Unitarian Universalists, and our connections to our living tradition. We light our chalice each week to remind us of the spark of love and hope that resides within each of us. To help us light our chalice this morning, I am happy to invite Olivia Bassett-Kennedy. And I would like to invite each of you to take this moment to grab your chalice or a candle and light it along with us, knowing that the light and the spirit of all of our chalices will be carried into the congregational meeting that follows this service. And now, would you please join your voices as we say, "We light this chalice for the light of truth. We light this chalice for the warmth of love. We light this chalice for the energy of action. We light this chalice for the harmony of peace." Thank you. Another way we will begin our time together this morning, just as we do each week, is by collectively speaking the words of our community's covenant. Our covenant reminds us of the promises that we make to one another about how we strive to be in relationship with each other, as we, each of us, are journeying towards a deeper understanding of what it means to be human. As a community, we promise to support, to care for, and to hold up one another along this journey. And so, let us join our voices once again in speaking the words of our covenant. The spirit of this church is law, and service is its law. This is our covenant with each other, to dwell together in peace, to search for truth and love, and to help one another.
Good morning. I love a routine. Routines can provide comfort and stability as we try to manage the chaos of daily life. But what happens when routines and habits close us off from possibility? How do we honor traditions that have sustained us without becoming insular or rigid? What do we miss when we stubbornly stick to the familiar and become attached to the way it's always been? Our story for all ages this morning lifts up the magic that can happen if we open our minds and our hearts to new ways of being in the world and with one another. The Creature of Habit, written by Jennifer E. Smith, illustrated by Leo Espinosa. On the island of Habit, there lived a creature. He had very big teeth, and very big eyes, and very, very big feet. Every day, the creature did the exact same things in the exact same order. First, he ate 3 pineapples and 2 bananas. Then he walked down to the water to say hello to the fish. "Hello, fish." After that, he went looking for shells, but he kept only the very best ones. Next, he said hello to the trees. "Hello, trees." And the rocks. "Hello, rocks." And the crab who lived under the rocks. "Hello, crab." When it was time for dinner, he ate 3 more pineapples and 2 more bananas. Then he brushed his teeth and went to bed. Every day was exactly the same, which was just how the creature liked it. Then one morning he spotted a boat. It was a very small boat, and it was carrying a very small creature. He had very small teeth, and very small eyes, and very, very small feet. Nobody had ever visited the island before, and the very big creature couldn't wait to show his new friend how everything worked. He taught him how to collect pineapples and bananas and how to say hello to the fish. Hello, fish. Hello, fish. He showed him how to find all the very best shells and when to eat his dinner and brush his teeth and go to bed. The next morning, the very big creature woke up excited to do it all over again, just like he did every day. But the very small creature was nowhere to be found. When he finally appeared, he was excited to start the day too, only instead of eating 3 pineapples and 2 bananas, he ate a single coconut. Instead of saying hello to the fish, he went for a swim with them. And instead of collecting shells, he collected, well, everything else. When it got dark, the very small creature didn't eat dinner or brush his teeth or go to bed. He just sat on the beach and looked at the stars. Watching him, the very big creature's very big eye began to twitch. This wasn't how things were done on the island of habit. There was supposed to be a schedule, a routine, an order to things. Otherwise, anything could happen. For the next week, the very big creature kept an eye on the very small creature. Some days, the very small creature made sandcastles after breakfast, and some days he stood on his head before dinner. Some days he slept in, and some days he stayed up late. Some days, he did nothing at all. It was absolute madness! Then one morning, as the very big creature was eating his breakfast, the very small creature offered him an orange. The very big creature looked at it carefully. It was smaller than a pineapple and rounder than a banana. It was something he'd never tried before. And it was pretty good, but not as good as a pineapple. Afterward, he noticed the very small creature saying hello to the clouds. The very big creature had said hello to a lot of things, the trees and the rocks and the crab who lived under the rocks, but never the clouds. He thought about giving it a try, but he didn't want to miss his appointment with the fish. Later, the very small creature found some treasures on the beach, and even though he was meant to be looking for shells, the very big creature was secretly happy when he found a treasure too. The day was almost done. It was time to eat dinner and brush their teeth and go to bed. But the very small creature had other plans. The very big creature watched him go, thinking about all the unusual things that had happened that day. The orange, and the clouds, and the treasures on the beach. The very big creature sat down. Then he stood up again, his very big heart beating very, very fast. Finally, he decided to follow the very small creature. The very big creature had never been out at this hour before. Everything looked different. The sky was full of color, and the sun, as round as an orange, was disappearing into the water. He knew this wasn't where he was supposed to be right now, but as the world turned from pink to orange to purple all around him, he wondered if maybe it actually was. Later, they would eat dinner and brush their teeth and go to bed. And tomorrow, there would be time to stick to the schedule, if they wanted to. After all, anything could happen. But for now, the sky was beginning to perform yet another magic trick. Together they sat and watched it change. Hello, stars. Hello, stars. The end.
Thank you, Stella, for that story. How do we navigate uncertainty? How do we navigate that which is familiar? How do we hold on to what we like about what is familiar, even as the world requires us to evolve and grow with changing circumstances? We are always confronted with this set of questions, which led to some interesting reflection on my part over the past week. These are needs that are certainly needs of our current time, but they're not just needs of our current time. Our forebearers in Unitarian Universalism felt the intensity of this kind of angst back in the early 1960s as the two denominations, Unitarianism and Universalism, chose to merge. It almost didn't happen. If you can imagine that, it almost didn't happen around wordsmithing, around wanting to get the words just right that could reflect what this new tradition was going to be, this coming together, this merging and uniting of Unitarian and Universalism. But they managed it. It was pulled off. The magical, correct words were arrived at to capture who and what we were going to be together. But the angst didn't go away, even after finding the right words. And over the course of the next decade, the remainder of the 1960s, questions kept swirling about, such as, who are we as this joint thing of Unitarian Universalism? What is holding us together? What is our essence and core? Who's even a part of us? What are we about? This led to some significant studying and surveying, not surprising given the intellectualism of our tradition. In the late 60s, a study was commissioned to tackle precisely these questions. And the chair of that process was an individual by the name of Robert Tapp. What Tapp and his colleagues found at the end of this study process, which concluded in 1973, was that about 10.5% of the folks that were in this new denomination called Unitarian Universalism were born into it. But another 12% were raised in families that identified as Unitarian Universalism, even if they weren't born into it. Those numbers collectively meant that more than 75% of folks that were a part of this new Unitarian Universalist denomination were individuals who had arrived at either Unitarianism, Universalism, or the merged Unitarian Universalism on the other side of other religious experiences or no religious experience at all. This was a common experience. In fact, even the majority experience. We sometimes refer to this set of folks in our movement as the come-inners, the folks who've arrived from either some other religious experience or no religious experience at all. And what this study found is that there were some common threads, not just for this group, the majority that were kind of come-inners, but across the board. There were characteristics such as a focus on their word, maturation, meaning growing, evolving, learning together. Also, they use the Emersonian concept of self-cultivation, self-directed learning and growth. I would add the phrase self-authoring. So as opposed to simply accepting the stories, narratives that others have handed us, we actively own and claim our agency to be the authors of our own destiny, of our future, of the life that we're living, the things that we believe in and subscribe to. All of this collectively pointed towards, as Robert Tapp and his colleagues on this commission pointed out in their study, the centerpiece were values. Now, this is so interesting because these were the leaders who had spent crucial years arriving at a statement of principles in 1960 which were designed to hold us together as this merged Unitarian Universalism, and that's not what they were referring to as a centerpiece and core of what was kind of holding us together or creating our core sense of identity. Rather, it was values. And those values, they found, were engaged in a certain process. For the come-inners, it involved a process of leaving behind values that did not fit, a reflective process, perhaps an experience of cognitive dissonance, whatever it might be, but certain values that had previously been understood as an organizing principle for one's life don't fit anymore, and so there's an examination process, a reflection process that has led to growth, a redefinition of one's core values. Those core values that one's then arrived at, a re-understanding of what it means to be human and how to live in the world. Then the last piece was institutional affiliation in alignment with those values. But the core process was values, and I want to invite us to hold on to that because I think that that's an important thread throughout the history of our movement, and it continues to be till today. Let's jump back to the concept of principles for just a second. The current version of the Unitarian Universalist principles were officially adopted in 1985. It was a long process to get to those as well. And by the way, almost a complete rewrite of the 1960 principles. So the words that were so carefully and politically negotiated in 1960 were not held onto as dogma. They were held with a certain amount of lightness that allowed us to revisit them and come up with a new articulation, a new formulation in 1985. Why? How did we arrive at that 1985 articulation? We have the women of Unitarian Universalism to thank for that. It was years of effort by women Unitarian Universalist leaders who saw in the original 1960 articulation of principles gender-based language that they felt we could do better on, that we could arrive at languaging that was more gender inclusive, and that was the primary thrust of revising our principles in 1985, though not the only goal or imperative that was fulfilled in that revision. Now here, again, after careful negotiation and reflection arriving at that 1985 articulation, the chairman of that process, named Walter Royal Jones, was then interviewed about 14 years later. And here's what he had to say in 1999, 14 years after the adoption of the current version of the Unitarian Universalist principles that are familiar to most of us. He said, quote, "Some are uneasy with what they see as a kind of creeping creedalism in the way Unitarian Universalists are using the principles," end quote. Creeping creedalism, what do we mean by a creeping creedalism? Well, perhaps never shall a word or a comma or a punctuation mark be changed in the principles. That's certainly creedal, isn't it? A rigidity, a tightly holding on to the thing that has been arrived at, even though that's not really part of our tradition. Walter Royal Jones, who chaired the process that arrived at our current articulation of principles, noting that 14 years after its adoption, those principles' adoption. He went on to say, quote, "There is also a perception of incompleteness, an excessive emphasis on the individual such that," again, quote, "the creative nature of community and interdependence are only tardily and inadequately acknowledged," end quote, in the current articulation of our principles. I think of this in a slightly different way. Many of you have heard me refer to our principles as ethical statements, which I believe, and that's how I relate to our principles. Now, if we take that and look at that for just a bit, if they are statements of ethics, of how we are invited to live in the world, what we're invited to bring alive in our own human being and living, ethics as a field of inquiry is not fixed. How we arrive at ethical understandings, how we interpret things ethically is not fixed. It is a constantly evolving set of understandings. So, for example, there were times in human history and human living when slavery was by and large culturally accepted. There were times in human living and human history when the fact that women were denied the ability to vote was accepted as ethically moral and correct. There were times in human history and human living when there was no concept of reproductive rights or reproductive justice. Those were ethical understandings that evolved, that we arrived at over time. Ethics is not rigid and it is not fixed, which circles us back to Walter Royal Jones's noticing of creeping creedalism. We have never been a creedalistic faith that is wedded to every punctuation mark or every word in a statement, because we understand that what it means to be human, what we're learning and experiencing and understanding about that is in evolution, that it is part of an evolving sense of what it means to be human. What guides us, what has always guided us Unitarian Universalists amidst an evolving sense of ethics, an evolving sense of what it means to be human, are an enduring set of values. An enduring set of values. So far before 1961, which was the first articulation of principles in Unitarian Universalism, our denominations, our intellectual traditions that we belong to, existed for decades and centuries before any articulation of principles ever occurred. And that history is one that we are not only deeply connected to, but we should take great pride in. This is the living tradition that Michael Servetus was burned at the stake for. Burned at the stake due to his value, his commitment to the use of individual conscience in the field of religion. He was burned as a heretic, and yet that value is one that continued to inform us and guide us as a movement. Francis David, the Hungarian, Transylvanian Unitarian minister, leading us towards an ethic of religious tolerance, that sense of religious tolerance continuing to guide and inform us to this very day, informing our sense of what it means to be inclusive in community, an intellectual forebearer guided by values, values that we hold dear still. Henry David Thoreau bringing alive the value of individual conscience and bringing it alive as civil disobedience at the personal level, in alignment with seeking a greater sense of justice in the world. Henry David Thoreau's sense of justice continuing to guide us and be dear to us. Suffragettes, critical leaders on both the Unitarian and Universalist sides of our family tree, pointing us towards greater equality, that value and commitment to greater equality. Us being founders, our movement being founders in the reproductive justice movement, founders of the NAACP, all of these values-based justice movements, all of these imperatives that existed amongst us Unitarians and Universalists well before we had any sense of principles printed on a page of paper. In 2003 to 2005, I served as a member of a commission called the Commission on Appraisal that did a study of what might hold us Unitarian Universalists together. By the way, this is an ages-old question that we revisit periodically with some angst. What is holding us together, if anything? In that particular set of wondering, we wondered if there's anything theologically core, anything theologically central. And what we found as commissioners in that process was that while there may not be any one thing that is theologically central or core for all Unitarian Universalists, that doesn't mean that what is in the center is a void or a vacuum. Rather, what that commission pointed to was one set of possibilities, one central set of possibilities, such as community. I'm going to quote from that report. Quote, "The Commission found that theologically as diverse as we Unitarian Universalists are, what unifies us far outweighs what divides us. We are a community of faith given to engagement with our world using the power of the institution to work for justice and freedom, whether it is religious or otherwise. The core of Unitarian Universalist faith embraces our theological similarities and differences," and the emphasis there is on community, that we have given ourselves to the value of community, of being in companionship with one another. And I can add to this one more core value, that original 1960 articulation of principles, the very first time we as Unitarians, Universalists, and Unitarian Universalists tried to define who and what we are. What value or key concept was included in that 1960 articulation that isn't currently? It was the value of love. Our original Unitarian Universalist principles included a core commitment and understanding to the value of love. We, grounded in our values, are the living embodiment of a living faith. Not one that we hold on to with rigidity and lack of flexibility, but one that we understand is evolving and growing in the same way that any of us are in our own individual lives. And it's in that living, in the flexibility of that living, in the support of that growth and evolution that we realize our highest potential together. May it always be so.
I invite you to turn to number 131 in the gray hymnal, "Love Will Guide Us." Let us join together in singing number 131.
Dear ones, as we now move into our congregational meeting, remember that we are a beloved community, a people of faith and action in covenant with one another. Open your hearts and minds to the possibility of forging new paths into the future. Don't be afraid of uncertainty, for, as author Seth Godin writes, if you wait until the fear is gone, you will never start, and you will rarely do anything that matters. As we gather to do the work of community, heed also the wise words of novelist Tom Robbins. You should never hesitate to trade your cow for a handful of magic beans. May it be so. Amen, and blessed be.